The cannon that brought down the greatest walls in human history was first offered to the man defending them. In the year 1452, a Hungarian engineer named Orban stood before the last Roman emperor and offered to build him the most powerful weapon on earth. The emperor wanted it desperately, but his treasury was empty. He could not pay. So Orban bowed, walked out of the city, and built his monster for the enemy instead, for a 21-year-old sultan who had sworn to take Constantinople or die trying. What followed was 53 days of the most dramatic siege in human history, 1,100 years of empire, 100,000 men against 8,000, ships sailing over dry land, blood-red omens in the sky. And at the end of it all, if one chronicler is to be believed, the fate of the Roman Empire came down to a single unlocked door. To understand how the empire that ruled the world became a single city fighting for its life, you have to go back 1,000 years to the moment Rome split in two. In 395, the dying emperor Theodosius divided the Roman world between his two sons. The West got Rome, and with it, chaos, broken borders, barbarian armies, and empty treasury. The East got something better. It got Constantinople, a city founded by Constantine the Great on the narrow strait where Europe stares across the water at Asia, surrounded by sea on three sides, sitting on the richest trade routes on the planet. The West had less than a century to live. We told that story in our last episode. But the East, what historians now call the Byzantine Empire, though its people never used that word, its people called themselves Romans to the very last day, the East would endure for another 1,000 years. And its death sentence, when it finally came, would be signed by fellow Christians. The secret to that endurance was a wall. In the early 400s, the Emperor Theodosius II built a barrier across the city's landward side, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not one wall, but three, rising in tiers behind a moat, studded with nearly 100 towers, stretching 5.5 kilometers from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. For 1,000 years, these walls were simply unbreakable. Armies arrived, looked up, starved, and went home. And behind the walls stood everything else that made this empire a survivor. The gold solidus, a currency so stable merchants from Britain to China trusted it for 7 centuries. A diplomatic corps that could turn enemies against each other with a single, well-placed bribe. And a weapon so secret its formula was a state mystery, guarded like a holy relic, a liquid fire that burned on water. They would need all of it, because for 1,000 years the world took turns trying to kill this city. Persians and Avars together in 626, while the emperor and his army were hundreds of miles away. The city held. Then came the Arabs twice, in 2 of the greatest sieges of the age. In 674, they blockaded the city for 4 straight years, and it was here that a refugee engineer named Kallinikos unveiled the empire's terrible secret for the first time. Greek fire, sprayed from bronze siphons mounted on ships, an inferno that clung to wood and flesh, and burned even as it floated on the waves. The Arab fleet was incinerated. They came back 40 years later with an armada, and it happened again. Over the centuries, the city withstood siege after siege after siege, more than 20 of them. Every great power of the medieval world took its shot. Every one of them failed, and then the empire received a wound that no wall could stop. It happened in 1071 at a place called Manzikert, in the mountains of eastern Anatolia. The Emperor Romanos marched out to push back a new enemy, the Seljuk Turks, nomad horsemen recently converted to Islam. And in a single catastrophic afternoon, his army was shattered and he himself was taken prisoner. The first Roman emperor captured in battle in 8 centuries. The Sultan, to everyone's surprise, treated him as a guest and let him go. It didn't matter. The damage was done. In the chaos that followed, the empire lost Anatolia, the great heartland that had fed its cities and filled its armies for centuries. Within a decade, Turkish horsemen were watering their horses within sight of Constantinople itself. The empire fought on, clawed some territory back, endured. But from Manzikert onward, it was a wounded giant, and the blow that would cripple it forever came not from the east, but from the west. In 1204, an army of crusaders, Christian knights sworn to liberate Jerusalem, arrived at Constantinople in Venetian ships, entangled in debts and dynastic promises. What happened next shocked even the medieval world. The Crusaders stormed the greatest Christian city on earth, and for 3 days they tore it apart. They looted the churches, melted down thousand-year-old statues for coin, enthroned a prostitute on the patriarch's chair in Hagia Sophia while drinking from the holy vessels. The 4 bronze horses that had watched over the city's hippodrome for centuries were carted off to Venice, where they stand to this day. A French crusader knight wrote that never since the world was created had so much booty been taken from a single city. The Byzantines did retake their capital 57 years later, but they inherited a corpse, a city of ruins, an empire of fragments. Constantinople never recovered, and the man who would finish what the Crusaders started would not be born for another 200 years. He came from a people no one in Constantinople had even heard of a century earlier. Around 1300, on the ruins of Seljuk Anatolia, a minor Turkish warlord named Osman ruled a territory you could ride across in a day. His descendants, the Ottomans, would build the most efficient war machine of the age. In 1354, they crossed into Europe and never left. They took the Balkans piece by piece, crushed the Serbs at Kosovo, annihilated a crusade of Europe's finest knights at Nicopolis. And with each conquest, the noose around Constantinople tightened. By 1400, the math was surreal. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 2 continents, and the Roman Empire consisted of 1 city and a few scraps of Greece. The emperor of the Romans was now officially the Sultan's vassal, paying tribute for the privilege of existing. Constantinople had become something almost absurd, an imperial head without a body, a city-state with a 1,000-year-old crown, completely surrounded waiting. The emperors knew exactly what was coming, and they did something no Roman emperor had ever done. They went begging. Manuel II spent 3 years touring the courts of Europe, pleading for a rescue. He dined with the King of England at Eltham Palace, where jousts were held in his honor. He stood in Paris while crowds gawked at this exotic emperor from the edge of the world. Everyone was moved, everyone promised, no one came. His son went further, to the Council of Florence in 1439, and signed away the independence of the Orthodox Church itself, submitting to the Pope in exchange for a crusade. His own people never forgave him. In the streets of Constantinople, a Grand Duke spat out the words that became the age's most famous bitter joke. Better the Sultan's turban than the Cardinal's hat. The one crusade that did finally march in 1444 was annihilated at Varna on the Black Sea coast. There would be no rescue. The city was alone. And then, in 1451, the doomsday clock found its final hand. The old Sultan died, and his son Mehmed II took the throne at 19, a cold, brilliant, multilingual young man who had been obsessed with one single idea since childhood: taking Constantinople. Europe's diplomats read him as a harmless boy. Within a year, the boy built a fortress. It rose in just 4.5 months on the European shore of the Bosporus, at the narrowest point of the strait, directly across from a fortress his great-grandfather had built on the Asian side. Together, the 2 castles closed Constantinople's throat, and Mehmed named his creation accordingly, Bogazkesen, the throat cutter. When a Venetian ship ignored the new rules and tried to run the strait, Mehmed's new cannons blew it out of the water, and the survivors were executed on the shore. The message was received in every court in Europe, and this is where the Hungarian engineer from the beginning of our story walks back in, on the wrong side of the walls. Orban had offered his services to the emperor first. Constantine XI, the last of them, a brave, capable, penniless soldier emperor, wanted the weapon badly, but he could barely feed his garrison, and the tiny stipend he scraped together wasn't even paid on time. So the engineer crossed the lines and Mehmed gave him everything: 4 times the salary and unlimited bronze. At the foundries of Adrianople, Orban cast a monster the world had never seen: 27 feet of bronze firing a stone ball weighing over half a ton. It took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to drag it 140 miles to the walls of Constantinople. It was so violent it could only fire 7 times a day, and its own gun crews sometimes died from the recoil and the bursting barrels. Its first test shot buried a stone ball 6 feet into the earth a mile away. Pregnant women reportedly miscarried at the sound. For 1,000 years, the walls of Theodosius had made Constantinople immortal. Orban's cannon existed to end that, By the first week of April 1453, the greatest army the Ottomans had ever assembled stood before the land walls. 80,000 fighting men and a sea of camp followers, with over 100 warships offshore. Behind the walls, the emperor conducted a census of every man able to hold a weapon. The number came back so devastating, it was kept a state secret. Roughly 8,000 defenders to hold 14 miles of wall. 2,000 of them were foreigners, and the best of those was a Genoese soldier of fortune named Giovanni Giustiniani, who had arrived in January with 700 armored men and a reputation as the finest siege commander in Europe. Constantine gave him command of the entire land wall. Across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the defenders stretched their last insurance policy, a massive iron chain floating on wooden pontoons, sealing the harbor from Ottoman ships. The emperor had no illusions. The Romans were making their last stand, and everyone on both sides of the wall knew it. The bombardment began on April 6th, and the world changed. For 1,000 years, the rules had been simple. Walls beat armies. Now, day after day, Orban's monster and dozens of smaller guns hammered the same stretch of the land walls, and the ancient masonry, built to shrug off catapult stones, cracked and slid and collapsed. The air over the city filled with dust that eyewitnesses said hung like fog, and here began the desperate rhythm that would define the next 7 weeks. By day, the cannons broke the wall. By night, the entire city, soldiers, women, monks, children, swarmed into the breach and rebuilt it with timber, rubble, and barrels of packed earth. In the morning, the Ottomans found, where the wall had fallen, a new rampart of earth that swallowed cannonballs like a pillow. Mehmed launched his first massed assault on April 18th and was thrown back, leaving hundreds dead against a defense that lost almost no one. The walls, even dying, were holding. Then the war moved to the sea. On April 20th, lookouts spotted 4 tall ships on the Marmara horizon, 3 Genoese vessels carrying men and supplies, and 1 imperial transport loaded with grain. Between them and the city waited the entire Ottoman fleet, over 100 ships. What followed played out like theater, watched from the walls by thousands and from the shore by the Sultan himself. The 4 tall ships smashed through the Ottoman line under full sail, their high decks raining crossbow bolts and Greek fire down onto the low galleys swarming around them. When the wind died directly beneath the city, the galleys closed in like wolves, and for an hour the 4 ships fought, lashed together, a floating fortress. Mehmed, screaming orders, rode his horse into the surf itself. And then the wind returned, the ships tore free, and the chain opened to let them into the harbor. The city exploded in celebration. The Sultan, humiliated before 100,000 of his own men, nearly executed his admiral on the spot, personally striking him with a staff before stripping him of everything he owned. Then Mehmed gave an order so insane his own commanders thought they had misheard it. If the chain would not let his fleet into the Golden Horn, the fleet would go around the chain. Over land, over a hill. His engineers laid a track of greased timber rollers stretching more than a mile up the ridge behind Galata and down the far side to the water. And on the night of April 22nd, to the sound of drums, teams of oxen and thousands of men hauled 70 warships, sails raised, crews sitting at the oars, up and over a 200-foot hill. Defenders on the walls at dawn saw the impossible, an enemy fleet in their sealed harbor, sails gliding over dry land like ghost ships. It is one of the most audacious feats in military history, and it changed the entire geometry of the siege. The Golden Horn walls, the city's soft underbelly, now needed defenders too, and there were no more defenders to give. 8,000 exhausted men now held 22 kilometers of stone. What followed was 5 weeks of slow strangulation and some of the strangest warfare of the Middle Ages. Serbian miners in Ottoman service dug tunnels toward the walls, meaning to collapse them from below. The defenders answered with a Scottish engineer named John Grant, who flooded the tunnels, smoked them out, and met the miners underground in knife fights by torchlight, until the mining simply stopped. A gigantic Ottoman siege tower rolled toward the walls. The defenders blew it apart in a midnight sortie with buried barrels of gunpowder. But every night the rebuilding crews grew thinner, food grew scarcer, and the promised Venetian relief fleet did not come. In mid-May, a small brigantine with a volunteer crew disguised as Ottomans slipped out to search the Aegean for that fleet. They found empty sea in every direction, and then those 12 men held a vote on the open water: sail away to safety or return to a doomed city to report the truth. They sailed back. When they told the emperor no one was coming, he thanked each man and wept. Then the sky turned against them. On the night of May 22nd, the full moon rose over the dying city in partial eclipse, swollen and dark like a wound, and every soul on both sides of the walls remembered the old prophecy. Constantinople would stand until the moon gave a sign. Days later, the city carried its holiest icon through the streets in a final procession: the Hodegetria, the protectress that had watched over the city for 1,000 years. And halfway through the procession, the icon slipped from its bearers and crashed into the mud. And the men who rushed to lift it swore it had turned heavy as lead. Then a thunderstorm with hail broke over the procession so violently it had to be abandoned. Then came a fog no one had ever seen in May, and in the night, watchers on both sides saw an unearthly red glow playing around the dome of Hagia Sophia. In the Ottoman camp, the omens read one way, inside the walls the other. Either way, everyone now believed the same thing: it was ending. Mehmed offered terms one final time: surrender the city and every soul walks free. Constantine's answer survives, and it is the answer of a Roman: to surrender the city is not mine to give, nor any man's who lives in it, for we are all resolved to die of our own free will. On the evening of May 28th, as 53 days of bombardment fell silent and the Ottoman camp blazed with torches and prayer, something without precedent happened inside the walls. In Hagia Sophia, Orthodox and Catholic clergy, men who had refused to pray together for 400 years, held one final liturgy side by side, and the whole city came. Afterward, Constantine gathered his commanders and asked forgiveness of every man for any wrong he had ever done them. And eyewitnesses wrote that even the hardest soldiers wept. The emperor rode the walls one last time in the darkness. Mehmed had promised his army the city's ancient rule of war. A fallen city belongs to the victors for 3 days. Both sides understood. There would be no tomorrow night. At 1:30 in the morning on May 29, 1453, the entire Ottoman line surged forward at once, and every bell in Constantinople began to ring. Mehmed spent his men like ammunition, in waves. First the irregulars, thousands of them, driven into the breach to exhaust the defenders and die. Then the Anatolian regulars, hurled at the broken stretch of wall by the Lycus stream, beaten back by Giustiniani's armored line. For 4 hours, the 8,000 held the 80,000. As dawn approached, Mehmed committed his final card: the Janissaries, the empire's elite, advancing in terrifying silence to the pounding of massive drums. And at that precise moment, the defense's soul was struck down. A shot, a crossbow, bolt, or a lead ball, no two accounts agree, hit Giovanni Giustiniani, and the man who had held the walls for 7 weeks begged his men to carry him to the ships. The Genoese saw their commander leave and followed him. Panic is a disease, it spread in minutes. One chronicler swears the end came through the Kirka Porta, a small postern gate someone forgot to bar after a sortie, through which the first Ottomans slipped inside and raised their banners on the towers. Legend or not, what is certain is this: within the hour, the defense of the Lycus breach collapsed, and the Ottoman flood poured into the city that had defied the world for 11 centuries. Constantine XI, 88th Emperor of the Romans, saw the banners on the towers and understood. Eyewitnesses last saw him tearing the imperial eagles from his shoulders, drawing his sword, and charging on foot into the tide of men pouring through the breach. He was never seen again. The Ottomans later displayed a body identified only by purple boots embroidered with eagles, but those who knew him denied it was the emperor, and to this day, no one knows where the last Roman lies. Greek legend gave him a different ending. An angel turned him to marble at the moment of death, and the marble emperor sleeps beneath the Golden Gate still, waiting to wake. What followed him was the promised 3 days. Thousands died in the streets. Some 30,000 were marched off into slavery. The great doors of Hagia Sophia, where half the city had crowded praying for the miracle that always came, were broken with axes. That afternoon, Mehmed rode slowly through the gate of Carisius into his prize. At Hagia Sophia, he halted the destruction and walking through the wrecked imperial palace, the conqueror was heard murmuring the lines of a Persian poet. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The city of Constantine had stood for 1,123 years. The Roman story, counted from the legendary founding of Rome itself, had run over 2,000 years. And on a Tuesday in May, it ended, which is why, in Greek tradition, Tuesday is unlucky to this day. Mehmed, 21 years old, took the title Caesar of Rome and made the city his capital. But the fall of Constantinople did not just end a world, it detonated a new one. Greek scholars fled west with shiploads of ancient manuscripts, and their learning poured fuel on the fire we now call the Renaissance. With the old trade routes to the east now taxed by a hostile empire, the Atlantic kingdoms began funding madmen who promised new routes across open ocean. 39 years after the walls fell, one of them was named Columbus. Moscow crowned its princes as heirs of Byzantium and named itself the Third Rome. And the Theodosian walls still stand today. You can walk the breach at the Lycus where the last emperor vanished and stand in the spot where an empire of 1,000 years came down, if one chronicler is right, to an engineer's unpaid salary and a single unlocked door. History rarely repeats itself, but it never stops rhyming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.